Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Physiology 2, especially for you. As you can see in this image, in this video, it's all about the ventilation and the regulation of the whole process. If you look at this graph, you can see all the different steps in the flow. So for example, if you would start here with an increase in the arterial PCO2 that's detected or that is present, then through either the central chemoreceptors or the peripheral chemoreceptors, you can see that the medulla oblongata is triggered. That will trigger a response to the inspiratory muscles, and then ultimately that will lead to an increase in the ventilation. So this flowchart is actually a summary that we will break down in this video to explain which factors are detected, which factors can be regulated, and how ultimately everything relates to the regulation and in particular to what happens during exercise. Right. So in this table you can see a couple of situations, examples of conditions that could happen and what the influence would be on the alveolar PO2 and the alveolar PCO2. To give you just one example here, if, for example, the alveolar ventilation would go up, but there's no change in metabolism, you would expect an increase in the PO2 in the alveoli and a decrease in the PCO2 in the alveoli. Whereas if you look at this example, where an increase in metabolism, for example, as a result of exercise, is not accompanied by a change in ventilation, so alveolar ventilation is the same, then you would expect basically the opposite, where the PO2 in the alveoli would decrease and the PCO2 in the alveoli would increase. So I hope that these examples make sense and explain which situations you can expect and how PO2 values will change accordingly. But first, some definitions before we look into the details of the regulation, because from experience I know that sometimes a couple of P's or V's are different, or at least difficult to differentiate, and they do make a big difference. So let me just go through this list and explain how the P is different from the V. So here you can see the PO2, which stands for small p, partial pressure of O2. That is expressed in millimeters of mercury because that's the unit that is used for pressure. Similarly, for CO2, you have the partial pressure, small p, that explains the partial pressure of CO2. Capital V is volume, and VO2 is actually the total volume of O2 that is consumed by the body. So not just taken in, but actually consumed. And that is expressed in either liters per minute, that's the default unit, or sometimes, if we want to normalize to body weight, you would do milliliters per kilogram of body weight per minute. VCO2 is actually similar to VO2, about the volume of CO2, and in this case, the volume of CO2 that you would put out again in 1 minute because of your expiration. And again, that's expressed in liters per minute. And finally, the minute ventilation is VE, that we've covered also in earlier videos, and that is expressed in liters per minute. The last one is actually a ratio, RQ or RER. Let me explain that in the next slide, because it is the actual ratio. So RQ stands for respiratory quotient, RER stands for respiratory exchange ratio, more or less the same, but the ratio is what matters here, and that is VCO2 over VO2. And as you hopefully remember from Physiology 1, the RER or RQ will give you an indication on the use of the fuels at rest, because if you're using carbohydrates only as a fuel in the aerobic process, or you would use fats as a fuel, the RER will be different. Also, and that is something that you will definitely get into next year, in Physiology 3, for example, you will see that the RER will be an indication of maximal exercise. So it can be used as a criterion in the analysis of the results of a maximal exercise test to see if the test was actually maximal or maybe not. The minute ventilation we covered earlier, so tidal volume times breathing frequency, and is always expressed in liters per minute. Now, let's have a look at the different factors that are actually connected in the regulation to the minute ventilation at rest. As you can see, it's quite a list. So there's several factors ranging from cognitive brain factors to chemical factors and actually physical factors. So all these factors together will regulate the ventilation. So you can see it's a very sophisticated process, and it's not just something that depends on one factor. In this image, you can see how everything is connected. And ultimately, here you can see the medulla oblongata is basically the control center where all this input is actually analyzed and checked, and responses are then ultimately sent to the ventilatory muscles to either upgrade or downgrade the minute ventilation according to the needs. So this is really the control center, and this is where the integration happens, and we will see later that during exercise there are certain decisions to be made that will actually cause one factor maybe to be more dominant than another one. The humoral factors are about the chemistry, and that is where some of the next slides will show some examples of, and that is all based on the chemoreceptors. So we have peripheral chemoreceptors and we have central chemoreceptors, and they play an important role in the constant monitoring of the levels of O2, CO2, and acid. And as you can see in this slide, we have the peripheral chemoreceptors that respond to PO2, to acid, and to CO2, whereas the central receptors basically only respond to the CO2 levels in the brain extracellular fluid, and then indirectly, because of the buffer, also to acid. But the central receptors, that's the most important thing to realize here. The central receptors do not respond to O2. So O2 can only be detected by the peripheral receptors. And these peripheral receptors you can find right here, so in the arch of the aorta, and also here the carotid bodies are located. So how does it work? How do these different changes have an effect on minute ventilation? Well, in this graph you can see the minute ventilation on the vertical axis and the arterial PO2 on the horizontal axis. And what is interesting here to see is that around the normal 100 millimeters of mercury, the normal arterial PO2, you will see that an increase or decrease is not really going to do much to the minute ventilation. If you look at CO2 though, you will see that definitely that does have an impact either up or down depending on the pCO2. So what you see here, if you only slightly increase the amount of CO2, the pCO2, then automatically that will be accompanied by an increase in the minute ventilation. If you look at acid, then you can see a similar thing, that even a small increase in the amount of acid that is in the arteries, you can see that the minute ventilation will go up accordingly. So how is this all regulated? Well, here you can see that if you look at the amount of PO2 that, for example, is lowered, you can see all these different steps and how that will trigger the chemoreceptors, how that will trigger the ventilatory muscles to ultimately bring the values back to normal. Because that's what this whole regulatory process is all about. Especially for acid, you want to keep homeostasis. You want to make sure that the values remain relatively steady and normal. So if PO2 goes down or CO2 goes up, you want to upgrade the minute ventilation to bring all those values back to normal. So in this graph, or in this flowchart, you can see that here for CO2, there's actually two pathways. The first pathway is through the peripheral chemoreceptors that detect changes in pCO2, and here you can see that also the central chemoreceptors can also respond to changes in pCO2. Ultimately, they will trigger the same response to if the CO2 levels go up also upgrade the ventilation to bring back both the acid as well as the CO2 levels back to normal. And in this animation, you can see how all of this is coming together. So I'm just gonna play this video for you to show you how everything fits together. After this video, we will finish up with a couple of examples related to exercise.
In the carotid and aortic bodies, monitor blood oxygen, carbon dioxide, and pH. Impulses from these chemoreceptors are conducted to the control centers for heart and blood vessels via the glossopharyngeal and vagus nerves. Chemoreceptors in the medulla oblongata monitor blood carbon dioxide and pH. Decreased blood oxygen, increased carbon dioxide, or decreased pH decrease parasympathetic stimulation of the heart, which increases the heart rate. Decreased blood oxygen, increased carbon dioxide, and decreased pH increase sympathetic stimulation of the heart, which increases heart rate and stroke volume. Increased sympathetic stimulation of blood vessels increases vasoconstriction.
All right, so that was basically a nice summary of the individual components and how they all connect to get feedback about the chemistry and then feed that back into changes in ventilation. One example in a special application before we look into exercise is the example of free diving, where you can see that it's actually possible for you to manipulate CO2 levels in order to increase your breath holding time. Well, first I want to say as a disclaimer, please do not try this at home because this method is definitely effective from a physiological point of view, but it's actually also quite dangerous and can be lethal. But the idea is that if you remember one of those previous graphs where you saw that the body doesn't really respond so quickly or so responsively to changes in O2, but it does on CO2. And that is actually a trick that you can use to increase your breath holding time, because if you would hold your breath, normally automatically your body will start to trigger you to breathe again because you feel that urge. Well, the idea is that this is an urge that is generated or caused by CO2 and not so much by O2. So if CO2 values raise above a certain level, your body will automatically trigger you to start breathing again. And it's not so much a reduction in O2 that will trigger your breathing again. So if you want to increase your breath holding time, a trick that some freedivers use is that they basically hyperventilate before they really want to hold their breath in order for the CO2 to really be cleared from the blood and to really have low alveolar pCO2 levels. And that will then give them more time before the CO2 reaches the certain threshold that is required for you to start breathing again. But as you can imagine, it is a method that is not without any risks, because your PO levels will definitely continue to drop, even though that urge is not yet there to start breathing again. So in extreme cases, you could actually kill yourself by just holding your breath for too long if you have used this method to lower CO2. But it definitely shows how interestingly and how delicately the whole system works, and how chemoreceptors are actually regulating and monitoring and regulating your ventilation. But right now, as promised, we will look at exercise, because this is really where you can see how everything relates to practice. So if you look at one of those factors, then you can see that all these factors during exercise should make sense. PO2 levels can decrease in your skeletal muscles, for example, if a lot of O2 is actually used by them. PCO2 will be increased because it's produced a lot by the aerobic or even by the anaerobic system. And then as a result, also pH levels can go down because the acidity goes up. And as you can imagine, your temperature goes up. So all these factors related to the Bohr effect are likely to occur during exercise. Well, what's going to happen with the minute ventilation? Well, usually the minute ventilation will try to match the oxygen consumption that is required. So the VO2 will usually try, or the VE will try to match VO2. And in this graph, you can see how minute ventilation will change if you start exercising. So compared to rest, where you have a minute ventilation that is expressed like this, you can see that here almost instantly the ventilation will shoot up and then the whole system starts running. And then you can see that your minute ventilation, if the exercise is a steady state exercise, will reach a certain steady level at some point. And then as soon as you stop the exercise, you can see a pretty much radical drop in the minute ventilation, and that will then lower slightly further. Well, this graph is similar for heart rate, but you will see definitely a difference in the abruptness of the changes. So in the ventilation, you can have more abrupt changes than you will see in heart rate. And that's an interesting factor for us later to analyze, so please keep that in mind. So in this graph, this is a graph from the book of Kenny, where you can see that if the exercise is supposed to start at 0 minutes, and here you can see it will last for, let's say, 5 minutes at a steady workload, then here they have measured the pulmonary ventilation and expressed it on the vertical axis. And you see here that if you are looking at a heavy exercise, so at a high workload, then automatically the minute ventilation during the steady state is higher than during moderate and light. That makes quite sense. But what is interesting to see is that the increase already starts before the actual exercise starts. So this is where you can see that this must be because of other factors than chemical factors, because literally nothing is happening yet. And also in the recovery, you can see that the recovery already can be initiated in terms of the ventilation already before you actually stop the exercise. So some sort of an anticipatory response is what you definitely can see both at the start and at the end of exercise when you look at ventilation. But the whole idea about ventilation is, again, to match what is required in terms of the consumption. And this is also an interesting graph that shows, for example, that the actual PCO2 in the alveoli is relatively steady or could even drop a little bit, whereas the mixed venous PCO2 will show a slight increase as the exercise intensity, because that's what the horizontal axis shows, increases. Overall, alveolar PO2 you can see remains quite steady, but at higher intensities actually you could see a slight increase in the PO2, which is interesting. Now, so these different factors that play a role we've mentioned before. The chemical control can definitely not account for everything, especially if you look at the beginning of the exercise, because there's no chemical changes yet. But definitely neural factors like your conscious or unconscious input definitely can control the amount of ventilation. Temperature, as it says right here, not so much. And here you can see the different phases. So in phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, you can see that different feedback mechanisms are used and different factors actually determine what the actual minute ventilation is expected to be. So it changes from a little bit more of the neuro input to the actual chemical equilibrium and the chemical control. And that is an interesting difference, for example, compared to the cardiac regulation. In recovery, as you saw in one of those examples, you could see that there's an abrupt decline possible of the ventilation, even though sometimes the chemical changes are still there. But those are definitely the reason why a little bit later there's a more gradual decline, because the body is still trying to get rid of those chemicals, and that still requires some extra or higher consumption than rest in terms of exercise, and therefore also the minute ventilation will gradually lower and will not completely go back to rest until you're recovered. If you look at the amount of ventilation compared to the amount of O2, then you see that in normal healthy adults, roughly per liter of O2 that you need for the consumption, you would actually ventilate around 25 liters. Interesting to see is that in children, this ratio is higher, which means that children actually need to breathe more per liter of O2 that they actually want to consume. And normally, there's a relatively linear increase if you look at the intensities. So if the intensity goes up, the consumption of O2 goes up, and that also is then matched by a linear increase in the ventilation. And at rest, you can see that normally in healthy people, definitely the cost of breathing is relatively small. And even during exercise, that cost is relatively small. But sometimes during extreme conditions, in extreme maximal exercise conditions, still a significant amount of energy could be spent on the respiratory muscles for actually producing this enormous minute ventilation. What these graphs show you, these are graphs from the book of McCardle. You can see that here is expressed the VO2, so the actual oxygen consumption, compared to the minute ventilation as a percentage of the total consumption. So it's a relatively linear increase, although the spread is huge, as you can see. So this means that the VO2 and VE have roughly a linear relationship. What you can see here is that if you express it per liter of minute ventilation, then the actual cost of breathing will go up as the exercise intensities go up. Well, that was all related to normal or healthy athletes, for example, but in pathological situations, for example, in COPD, you could see a definite increase and the cost of breathing being significant. And that is something that would then automatically limit exercise capacity because that amount of energy is already spent on just the breathing and not on, for example, the actual exercise like the biking or the running. What is interesting to note is that in maximal exercise, you can see that people, healthy people at least, and athletes actually breathe more than what you would think they need. So they hyperventilate a little bit. And that shows, again, that ventilation during exercise for healthy people, for athletes, is just never a limiting factor because they have a lot of overcapacity. One important exception is that in some cases, especially if athletes are super trained, sometimes what could happen is that there is a mismatch in the ventilation and perfusion. And we will see later on in this course, and definitely in exercise physiology that is covered in Physiology 3, that your body needs to make choices where to send blood. So if you are running at a very high intensity, you would like most of your blood to go through your skeletal muscles, your quadriceps, etc. And then, for example, take it away from your intestines or other organs. Now, it could happen that maybe also the blood flow through the pulmonary capillaries is reduced, and that could then cause certain areas of the lungs to be less perfused, which means that they are not really able to take up oxygen as well as you would normally. So this perfusion mismatch could actually cause a slight decrease in the amount of diffusion capacity, and that is something that you could expect in healthy elite athletes, but only as an exception to the rule. That is, again, never in normal healthy people is ventilation going to be a limiting factor during exercise. Well, finally, you can see what I mentioned already earlier is that the body usually tries to keep homeostasis, and especially pH levels are very important for the body to keep within a very, very small range. So that's the reason why an increase in CO2 or an increase in acid, for example, lactic acid, is usually something that the body tries to buffer in order to keep the pH level of the blood, for example, relatively constant. And that is something you can see in this picture right here. You can see that in the arterial blood there's a very small range in which the pH may fluctuate, and that is definitely something that is relatively small, and because of all these feedback mechanisms your body is able to do that by matching the ventilation to the actual acid levels in your arteries, for example. If you look at your muscles, you can see a similar range where you see that only a very small difference between 6.6 and 7.1 indicates the range in which the pH needs to stay. And that is the main reason why ventilation is so important, so that acid and CO2 and of course O2 can be regulated and that you can exercise as you want. And that was it for this video. I thank you for watching. I hope you will have a good day and see you in the next videos.